The gavel came down hard on wood. A little girl, just 6 years old, jerked back as though someone had physically struck her. Silas Thornton pushed his way through the gathered crowd, gripping 20 silver dollars in his clenched fist. And every single mother standing in Cedar Creek instinctively pulled her children in closer to her side. They all knew exactly what he was: a man who had killed, a ghost among them, someone who hadn't exchanged words with another living person for 3 whole years. Yet not one of them, not a single soul, had offered even a penny to rescue that child. But he had, and the moment he lifted her down from that auction platform, she felt lighter than the weight of his own guilt. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. Leave your city down in the comments below. And if this story moves you the way I believe it will, go ahead and subscribe. Stay with me all the way to the end. Trust me on this, you won't want to miss what happens when this little girl finally speaks. The girl shed no tears. That was the very first thing Silas took notice of, and it absolutely shattered something inside him. Every other child they'd paraded up onto that platform had cried or screamed or pleaded. But this one just stood there as if she'd been carved straight out of stone, barefoot on those splintered wooden crates, clutching a rag doll so worn and torn it was barely holding itself together. She stared straight forward at nothing in particular, at no one in particular, as though she'd already made the decision that the world held nothing worth her attention. Willa Mae Foster. The auctioneer read the name from his paper. 6 years of age. Parents deceased from fever. The orphanage has been shut down. A quiet child. Doesn't cause any trouble. Doesn't cause any trouble. As if that were the greatest compliment a grown man could bestow upon a 6-year-old girl. As if her entire worth boiled down to how little room she occupied in the world. The crowd shifted on their feet. Farmers leaned in to whisper to their wives. The wives whispered back. Not a single hand went up. Come on now, folks. Winter's on its way. We can't just leave the child out on the street. What's the matter with her? Someone shouted from the back. How come she doesn't speak? Some children fall silent after experiencing hardship. Nothing a firm hand won't correct. Silas felt his jaw clench tight. A firm hand. He'd witnessed firsthand what firm hands did to children who couldn't defend themselves. He'd seen it happen in orphanages and in work camps and in farmhouses where nobody bothered asking questions because nobody wanted to hear the truth. $5. Jake Guthrie called out from the left portion of the crowd. Silas knew Guthrie. Everyone in Cedar Creek knew Guthrie. The man worked horses until they collapsed and worked people until they shattered. His previous hired hand had limped his way out of town back in August with 2 cracked ribs and unpaid wages still owed to him. His wife before that had supposedly died of pneumonia, although the bruises covering her arms suggested a very different story. $5, I hear, the auctioneer announced. Do I hear 10? Silence. Silas told himself to just walk away. Reminded himself this wasn't any of his concern. Told himself he'd come down from this mountain for exactly 3 things: salt, coffee, and flour. A child was not on that list. Going once. The girl's fingers tightened ever so slightly on her doll. Just barely. Just enough for someone paying close attention to catch it. She recognized Guthrie's name. She understood exactly what that $5 bid meant for her future. Going twice. $20. His own voice took him by surprise. It emerged flat and hard, the same way it used to sound when he wore a badge and issued orders that men followed without questioning. The entire crowd turned around. 200 eyes landed squarely on him, and every single pair went wide with shock. He heard a woman let out a gasp. Heard a man mutter under his breath, "Lord Almighty." Heard that particular kind of silence that always seemed to trail behind him through Cedar Creek. The silence that came from people who were frightened but refused to acknowledge it. $20. The auctioneer repeated, his voice cracking slightly. From Mr. Thornton. Do I hear 25? Guthrie's face turned a deep shade of purple. He took half a step forward, then his eyes met Silas's. Really met them, and he thought better of whatever he'd been planning. Most men usually did. Silas stood taller than anyone else in that town, broad across the shoulders, with hands that had broken jaws and constructed cabins with the same level of efficiency. People moved out of his path the same way they'd move out of the path of a storm. Not because they respected him. Because of self-preservation, $20, going once. Going twice, the gavel cracked down. Sold. The crowd scattered like frightened quail, though the whispers lingered behind. What does that hermit want with a little girl? It ain't natural. Somebody really should do something. Well, you go do something then. I'm not getting in that man's way. Silas paid no attention to a single word. He walked straight up to the platform, pulled the leather pouch from inside his coat, and counted out 20 silver dollars into the auctioneer's trembling palm. One coin at a time, slowly enough to feel the weight of each one leaving his possession. "She's yours now," the auctioneer said, and that word, yours, made Silas's stomach twist because a child should never belong to anyone the way property belongs to someone. But that was precisely what this entire ugly business represented, selling children like livestock to whoever could afford the price. He looked up at Willa. She looked down at him. Her eyes were brown and ancient and hollow in a way that made him want to put his fist straight through a wall. Nobody should carry that look at 6 years old. Nobody should carry it, ever. "I'm not going to hurt you." He said it quietly enough that only she could possibly hear. "I know you've got no reason to believe that, but it's the truth." She studied him the way a trapped animal studies the thing standing between it and the exit, measured him, weighed him, decided nothing, but she didn't look away. "Can you climb down yourself? Or do you need help?" She climbed down on her own, landed softly in the dirt without making a sound, stood there beside him with her doll pressed tight against her ribs, and waited for whatever would happen next. Because whatever happened next was never her decision to make, and she'd long since stopped pretending otherwise. "You got any belongings? Anything you need to collect?" She shook her head once. That single shake hit him harder than the kick of a rifle. 6 years of being alive and nothing to show for it except a broken doll and a dress worn thin as breath itself. "All right, then. Let's go." They walked through town together, the giant and the ghost. Silas could feel the stares burning into his back like heat radiating from a fire, and he knew exactly what they were thinking. Every terrible scenario their small-town imaginations could dream up, they were dreaming it up right at that moment. And by tonight, every parlor in Cedar Creek would be humming with theories about why the mountain hermit had purchased himself a little girl. Let them talk. They'd been talking about him for 20 years. It hadn't killed him yet. As they passed by the feed store, Jake Guthrie stepped out from beneath the awning and blocked their path. He looked at Willa, then at Silas, and his lips peeled back from his teeth in something that couldn't quite be called a smile. $20, Guthrie said. "That's an awful lot of money for a man who lives all alone up in the woods. Makes a person wonder what a girl's worth to you." Silas didn't break his stride. He shifted his weight just enough to position himself between Guthrie and the child, and he kept his voice even and low. "Step aside, Jake. I'm just saying, folks are going to have questions. Folks can come ask me directly. You know where I live." Something in the way he said it made Guthrie's smirk die completely. The farmer stepped back, but his eyes followed them all the way to the end of the street, and Willa pressed in closer to Silas's leg without making the slightest sound. Copper was waiting at the hitching post, flicking her tail lazily at the flies. She was a good bay mare, steady and patient, the kind of horse that didn't startle at shadows. When Silas lifted Willa up into the saddle, Copper turned her head and sniffed curiously at the girl's bare foot, as if politely inquiring who this very small person was and whether she'd happened to bring any sugar. Willa's hand twitched, not quite reaching toward the horse's nose, not quite pulling away, caught somewhere between wanting to touch and being too afraid to want. "That's Copper," Silas said, swinging up into the saddle behind her. "She's friendlier than I am. Most things are." He thought he caught Willa's mouth move. Not a smile exactly, not words, but something. The trail climbed upward through pine and aspen, switchbacking up the mountainside in long, steady grades that Copper handled with the sure-footed patience of a horse who'd made this journey 1,000 times before. The sounds of the town gradually faded away. Hammers, voices, the clatter of a passing wagon, all replaced by wind and bird song and the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hooves striking packed dirt. For a full hour, neither of them spoke. Silas didn't apply any pressure. Whatever had locked itself up inside this child, it wouldn't come free just because a stranger asked polite questions on a horse trail. It would come free when it was ready, if it ever was. And pressuring her would only drive it deeper underground. At the creek crossing, he pulled Copper to a stop to let her drink. The air was thin and sharp and carried the scent of snow approaching. "Cabin's another hour further up," Silas said. "It's warm. Solid roof. You'll have the loft all to yourself." Willa said nothing, but her grip on the saddle horn loosened just 1 degree. "I'm not much for conversation," he added. "So, if the quiet bothers you, I apologize. If it doesn't, then we'll get along just fine." Nothing. But he felt her lean back against his chest. Just barely. Just the smallest fraction of weight shifted from holding herself completely rigid to letting something else hold her up. It probably didn't mean anything. She was probably just tired. But it didn't feel like nothing. They reached the cabin just as the sun dropped behind the peaks and the sky turned shades of orange and gold. Silas helped Willa down and watched her scan the clearing with quick, sharp eyes. The door, the windows, the tree line, the distance to the barn. She was mapping exits, cataloging cover, planning escape routes the same way he'd once taught soldiers to do in hostile territory. 6 years old, and she was assessing a building like a combat veteran. The thought made him feel sick and furious and sad all at the same time. "Loft's up there," he said from inside, nodding toward the ladder. "I'll build you a proper bed tomorrow. Blankets and a pillow for tonight." She climbed up without any hesitation. He heard her testing the floorboards, checking the window, examining every corner of that small space, making absolutely certain she could get out if she needed to. He let her be, built up the fire, put together supper, salt pork, beans, biscuits. When he set the plate down on the table, he realized he didn't own a chair small enough for a child. The seat came up to her chest. She'd have to kneel on it just to reach the table. He stared at the chair. The chair stared back. 20 years alone up in these mountains, and it had never once occurred to him that furniture came in different sizes. "We'll fix that tomorrow, too," he muttered. Willa climbed onto the chair without any complaint, kneeling on the wooden seat, and ate everything on her plate with the careful concentration of someone who understood that food was never a guarantee. She ate the way soldiers ate, fast, thorough, wasting absolutely nothing. When she finished, she sat with her hands folded in her lap and waited. "You don't have to ask permission to move around," Silas said. "This is your home now, such as it is." She slid off the chair and went straight to his bookshelf, stood up on her toes, reached out, and looked back at him with a question in her eyes. He pulled down the Longfellow. "This one's good company." She took it with both hands and held it against her chest the same way she held her doll, like something precious that could be snatched away at any moment. She climbed up to the loft, and a minute later he heard the sound of pages turning. Silas washed the dishes, banked the fire, sat down on the edge of his bed, and listened to the cabin sounds. Wind, settling logs. The owl that lived in the dead pine east of the barn, and underneath all of it, something new. The quiet breathing of a child reading herself to sleep in his loft. He hadn't heard that sound in 20 years. He didn't sleep, just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, running through every possible way this could go wrong, which was all of them. He didn't know how to raise a child, didn't know what children ate besides what adults ate, didn't know about braiding hair or nightmares or any of the 1,000 things a 6-year-old needed that had nothing to do with survival skills and everything to do with being human. Past midnight, the whimpering started. Soft, muffled. The sound of someone crying into their hands because they'd learned that crying out loud brought the wrong kind of attention. Silas climbed the ladder and found Willa sitting upright, clutching her doll with white knuckles, eyes wide open and seeing something that wasn't there. He didn't move any closer, just sat at the top of the ladder with his hands where she could see them. Bad dream? She blinked, focused on him. Nodded. I get those too. Most nights, if I'm being honest. Silence. Then she held up the doll, showed him the arm hanging by threads, the split seams, the stuffing leaking out. She pointed to the damage and then looked at him with a question she couldn't ask out loud. She's hurt, Silas said. Want me to try and fix her? The struggle on her face nearly killed him. The doll was everything she owned, everything she had left of whoever had loved her before the world took that love away. Handing it to a stranger was the bravest thing anyone could do. And she was 6 years old. She held out the doll. Silas took it with both hands, as gentle as holding a wounded bird. I'll be careful, I promise. Let me get my kit. He brought back a leather sewing case, scissors, cotton batting, and a lamp. The case was old, the leather soft and dark with age, initials stamped on the cover that he didn't allow himself to look at. He sat at the top of the ladder where Willa could watch every single stitch. His hands were big, scarred, rough from 20 years of splitting wood and skinning game, but they moved with a gentleness that would have shocked anyone in Cedar Creek. Small, even stitches, reinforced seams, fresh stuffing where the old had leaked away. This doll of yours, he said as he worked, keeping his eyes on the needle. She's been through hard times. But look here. He showed Willa the mended arm. The fixing makes her stronger than she was before. Broken things can come back tougher. Don't let anybody tell you different. Willa leaned in closer, close enough that her shoulder touched his arm. The contact was so light he might have imagined it, but he didn't imagine it. He finished the repair and held up the doll. Limbs secure, body solid, same stains and wear. But she looked cared for again, instead of abandoned. Willa took her back and tested the arm, pressed the doll against her cheek. Then she looked at Silas and smiled. Small, barely there, but real. She reached out and touched his hand. 1 finger, 1 second, then pulled back and held her doll tight. And the smile stayed on her face like sunrise holding to the edge of the mountains. You're welcome, Silas said. His voice came out wrong, thick and rough and cracked in the middle. He cleared his throat. Try and get some sleep. He climbed down the ladder and lay in the dark, listening. The whimpering didn't come back. After a while, her breathing went slow and even and peaceful. Silas closed his eyes. His hand still carried the scent of that leather sewing case, and for one unguarded moment, the scent took him back to a different cabin, a different time. A little girl with laughing eyes who called him Papa and believed he could fix anything in the world. He couldn't fix everything. He'd proven that 20 years ago. But tonight, he'd fixed one small thing for one small girl, and she'd smiled at him like he'd hung the moon. He pressed his scarred hand flat against his chest, where something that had been frozen absolutely solid for 2 decades was beginning, slowly and painfully, to crack. Outside, wind moved through the pines. Copper shifted in the barn. The owl called once and went silent. In the loft above, Willa Foster slept with her mended doll held tight against her heart. And Silas Thornton lay awake beneath her, afraid to hope and unable to stop. The first week taught Silas that everything he knew about survival was completely useless when it came to a 6-year-old girl. He could track a wounded elk through 3 feet of snow. He could build a fire in a rainstorm with nothing but flint and damp bark. He could read the sky and know within the hour when a storm would arrive, but he could not, for the life of him, figure out how to braid hair. Willa sat on the cabin floor on their 3rd morning together, her back to him, holding perfectly still while he stood behind her with a comb in one hand and a leather tie in the other, staring at her tangled auburn hair like a man staring at a map written in a language he'd never learned. I'm making it worse, aren't I? She nodded. Your doll's hair doesn't do this. She turned her head just enough to give him a look that said very clearly that comparing her hair to a cloth doll's yarn was absolutely not helping the situation. All right. He set down the comb. How about you handle the hair and I handle breakfast? She took the comb from him and had her hair sorted in under 2 minutes. Neat. Quick. Efficient. She'd been doing it herself for years. She hadn't needed his help. She'd let him try because he'd offered. And something about that realization, that she'd allowed him to fail at something just because he wanted to do it for her, sat in his chest like a warm coal all morning. They found their rhythm slowly, the way two people find a path through unfamiliar woods. Morning started with the animals. Silas showed her how to scatter feed for the chickens without startling them, how to check for eggs with gentle hands, how to talk to Copper in the low, steady voice that kept a horse calm. Willa listened to everything, watched everything, remembered everything. She moved through chores with the focused precision of someone who'd learned that usefulness was the only reliable protection against being discarded. That bothered Silas more than he could put into words. "You don't earn your keep here," he told her one morning as she swept the cabin floor for the second time before noon. "You understand? You're not here because you're useful. You're here because you belong here." She stopped sweeping, looked at him. The confusion on her face was so genuine it hurt, like he'd told her water ran uphill and expected her to believe it. "I mean it, Willa. Put the broom down. Come eat." She put the broom down, but he caught her checking over her shoulder at the floor, making sure it was clean enough, making sure she'd done enough to justify the food she was about to receive. That habit would take longer to break than any silence. October bled into November. The air turned sharp, and the first snow dusted the high peaks like powdered sugar. Silas made 2 trips to Cedar Creek for supplies. Both times the town watched him like he was a show they'd paid admission to see. Mrs. Opal Burke at the boarding house was the worst. She positioned herself on her porch like a sentry every time he rode through, arms crossed, lips thin, eyes tracking him from one end of Main Street to the other. "How's that girl of yours, Mr. Thornton?" she called out during his November trip. Her voice carried the false sweetness of someone collecting information they planned to use as ammunition. "She's well, eating properly, sleeping warm, got appropriate clothing for the season. She's well, Mrs. Burke." Opal Burke wrote something in the small notebook she always carried. "Folks are wondering when we might see her in town. Make sure she's thriving and all. Folks can mind their own business. Children are everybody's business, Mr. Thornton. Especially children in unusual circumstances." He bought his supplies and left without another word. But her questions followed him up the mountain like wolves tracking a scent, and he knew they wouldn't stop. Cedar Creek had decided that Silas Thornton and the mute orphan girl were a story, and stories in small towns had a way of growing teeth. Back at the cabin, Willa had spent the day working on something she didn't want him to see. She'd taken scraps of cloth from his mending pile and a needle from the sewing case. He'd told her she could use it. And when he walked through the door, she shoved whatever she'd been making under a blanket with the guilty speed of a child caught stealing cookies. He pretended not to notice, set the supplies on the table, started unpacking. "Got wool fabric for a winter coat," he said, "and flannel for a proper dress. Also picked up some writing paper and pencils if you're interested." The pencils caught her attention more than the fabric. She came to the table and touched one with her fingertip, then looked up at him with the question she always asked with her eyes. "For you," he confirmed. "Can you write?" She shook her head, held up her fingers. 5, then one more. 6. As if her age explained why writing was beyond her reach. 6 is old enough. You can read already. Writing's just the other half of the same thing. He pulled out a chair, the one he'd cut down and rebuilt to fit her 3 days after she arrived. Working in the barn at night so she wouldn't see the effort and feel obligated to thank him. "Sit down. I'll show you how." Teaching Willa to write became the center of their evenings. After supper, after the dishes, after the fire was built up for the night, they sat at the table with paper and pencils, and Silas guided her through the alphabet, letter by letter. His own handwriting was rough, a soldier's scrawl, but he knew the shapes and the sounds and the rules well enough to pass them on. She learned fast, faster than he'd expected. Within a week, she could copy words from his books. Within 2 weeks, she was forming her own. The first word she wrote without copying was doll. The second was home. The third, written on a cold November evening with the fire crackling and snow falling outside the window, was safe. She showed it to him without comment, just held up the paper and let him read the single word in her careful, shaky letters. Then she put the paper down and went back to practicing, as if she hadn't just cracked his chest open with 5 letters. Silas stared at the word for a long time after she climbed up to the loft that night. Safe. She felt safe in his cabin. With him, she felt safe. The words sat on the kitchen table like a living thing, breathing and warm. And he pressed his rough hand flat against it, as if he could hold the feeling in place and keep it from disappearing the way everything good in his life had always disappeared. December brought real cold. The kind of cold that froze water in the bucket overnight and turned breath to white clouds and made the trees crack like gunshots in the dark. Silas doubled the firewood supply and showed Willa how to bank the coals so the cabin stayed warm through the night. She took to mountain life with an adaptability that amazed him. She wasn't afraid of the cold or the dark or the isolation. She was afraid of people. And up here, there were no people. Just Silas and the animals and the endless sky and the silence that both of them had learned to wear like armor. But armor was meant to come off sometimes. And Silas started to see cracks in hers. It began with humming, soft, barely there. While she did her chores, tuneless at first, then gradually finding melodies he almost recognized. She hummed while feeding the chickens, while sweeping, while practicing her letters. She hummed the way someone tests ice before stepping on it, carefully, ready to pull back at the first sign of cracking. He never mentioned it, never acknowledged it, just let the sound fill the cabin the way water fills a dry creek bed, gradually, naturally, without anyone having to force it. Then came the laughing. It happened on a Tuesday morning in December. Silas was trying to collect eggs from beneath a hen named Gertrude, who had the temperament of a rattlesnake and the grip of a bear trap. Every time he reached under her, she pecked his hand hard enough to draw blood and made a sound like a rusty gate being forced open. "Gertrude," he said through clenched teeth, "I have skinned grizzly bears. I have survived 2 winters with nothing but jerky and creek water. I will not be defeated by a chicken." Gertrude pecked him again. He yanked his hand back, swore, and looked at Willa. She was laughing. Not the ghost of a laugh, not a silent tremor, an actual sound, small and rusty from disuse, like a music box that hadn't been opened in years, but real. Her eyes crinkled and her shoulders shook, and the sound came out of her like something that had been trapped for a very long time and finally found the door. Silas stared at her. She clapped her hand over her mouth, eyes wide, as if the sound had escaped against her will and she was trying to stuff it back in. "Don't you dare stop that," he said. "That's the best sound I've heard in 20 years. Her hand came down slowly. The laugh was gone, but the smile stayed. And Gertrude, apparently satisfied with the chaos she'd caused, finally shifted enough for Silas to grab the eggs. "Terrible bird," he muttered. But he was smiling too. And Willa saw it, and something between them shifted permanently into place. That night, he started carving the horse. He worked on it after she went to sleep, sitting by the fire with a block of pine and his detail knife, shaping it by lamplight with the patience he brought to everything worth doing. He hadn't carved anything for pleasure in 20 years, hadn't seen the point, but Willa was teaching him that some things didn't need a point. Some things just needed to exist because they were beautiful. And beauty was its own justification. He thought about Rosie while he carved. Not with the sharp, crushing grief that usually accompanied her memory, but with something softer, something that felt almost like gratitude. Rosie had loved watching him carve, had sat beside him for hours, asking questions about every cut, every shape, every decision. "Why this way and not that way, Papa? What's the wood trying to be?" He could almost hear her voice. And for the first time in 2 decades, hearing it didn't make him want to die. It made him want to keep carving. January brought the deepest snow Silas had seen in years. The trail to Cedar Creek became impassable for days at a time, sealing them in their mountain world like 2 creatures in a den. Far from feeling trapped, Willa seemed to expand in the isolation. She wrote every day now, filling pages with observations and questions and small stories about the chickens and copper and the birds she watched from the cabin window. She showed him her journal one evening, sliding it across the table with the shy pride of someone sharing something precious. He read it slowly. Her spelling was creative, her grammar rough, but the voice on the page was unmistakably hers, direct, observant, surprisingly funny. "Gertrude laid 2 eggs today," he read aloud. "She only pecked Silas once. I think she is getting nicer. Or maybe Silas is getting faster." He looked up. Willa was watching him with an expression he'd come to recognize as hope disguised as indifference. The face of someone who desperately wanted approval but had learned not to show it. "This is good writing," he said. "Real good." The indifference cracked. Underneath it was pure, uncomplicated joy. "You should keep at it. Write about whatever you want. The garden you're planning. The things you're learning. Whatever's in your head. Words are the strongest thing a person can own, Willa. Nobody can take them from you once you've got them." She nodded and took the journal back and held it against her chest, the same way she held Miss Jenny, the same way she held the Longfellow, like it was something the world might try to steal. Late January, Silas made his monthly supply run and found Cedar Creek buzzing like a kicked hive. Dr. Nathaniel Hale intercepted him outside the general store before he'd even tied copper to the post. "Thornton, a word." Hale was a lean, quiet man in his 50s. One of the few people in town Silas respected. He didn't gossip, didn't speculate, didn't waste words. When he spoke, it was because something needed saying. "There's a man asking questions about you. Territorial child welfare officer named Clarence Yates came through last week." Silas felt the cold settle deeper into his bones. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that come before official investigations." He talked to Opal Burke, talked to Guthrie, talked to half the town. Hale paused. Most folks told him the girl seemed fine from what little they'd seen, but Opal told him she'd never laid eyes on the child since the auction, and Guthrie told him whatever Guthrie tells people, which is never anything good. "What's your opinion?" "I think you should bring the girl to town. Let me examine her. Let people see she's healthy and cared for. Right now, all they've got is speculation, and speculation in a town like this turns poison fast." Silas bought his supplies in silence, loaded the mule, and rode home with Hale's warnings sitting on his shoulders like a second winter coat. He'd built his mountain life specifically to avoid this. The interference of people who knew nothing about his circumstances but felt entitled to opinions about them. But Willa wasn't just his life anymore. She was her own person with her own future, and that future could be destroyed by a bureaucrat with a clipboard and a set of assumptions about what a proper family looked like. That evening, Willa noticed something was wrong. She always noticed. She'd spent years in an orphanage reading adults' moods for survival, and she could detect a shift in Silas's temperament the way he could detect a shift in the weather. She slid her journal across the table. She'd written a single line. "What happened in town?" He looked at her for a long time. She looked back with those brown eyes that saw everything and forgave nothing and demanded the truth because she'd been lied to enough for one lifetime. "There's a man from the territorial government," Silas said slowly. "His job is to check on children, make sure they're being treated right. He's been asking about you, about us." She didn't flinch, didn't react at all for a moment. Then she picked up her pencil and wrote with careful, steady letters. "Will they take me away?" "Not if I can help it." "What do I need to do?" The question gutted him. Not what will you do to protect me, but what do I need to do? As if the burden of staying safe had always been hers to carry because no adult had ever carried it for her. "You don't need to do anything," he said firmly. "You just keep being who you are. I'll handle the rest." She studied his face the way she'd studied it that first day on the auction block, measuring, weighing, deciding. Then she wrote one more line, underlined it twice, and turned the journal so he could read it. "This is my home. I'm not leaving." Silas read the words. Read them again. Felt something in his chest that wasn't grief or fear or the familiar ache of old wounds. It was something fiercer, something that had teeth and claws and would fight to the death if it had to. He looked at the girl across the table, this small, silent, unbreakable person who had walked into his fortress and turned it into something worth defending. And he made her a promise he had no legal right to make, but meant with every broken piece of his heart. "No," he said, "you're not." Outside, the wind picked up and drove snow against the windows in rattling waves. Inside, the fire burned steady, and two people who had every reason to be afraid of the future sat together at a kitchen table, planning how to fight for the only thing that mattered, each other. Silas brought Willa to Cedar Creek on the first Sunday in February. Reverend Ezra Whitfield had arranged it, a church service followed by a community dinner, a chance for the town to see the girl and put their worst suspicions to rest. Silas hated every part of the plan, except the part where it might keep Willa safe. They rode down the mountain in silence. Willa wore the blue wool dress she'd sewn herself, with white cuffs and a collar that she'd stitched so precisely Silas couldn't find a single crooked seam. Her hair was braided. She'd done it herself, obviously, and Miss Jenny rode in the saddlebag because Willa had decided that bringing a doll to church was something a baby would do, and she was not a baby. "You don't have to talk to anybody," Silas told her as the town came into view. "You don't have to smile. You don't have to perform. Just be yourself." She gave him a look that said she was 6 years old and didn't need instructions on how to exist in public. "Thank you very much." "Fair enough," he muttered. The church was a white clapboard building at the north end of Main Street, the only structure in Cedar Creek that got a fresh coat of paint every spring. Silas hadn't set foot inside it in the 20 years he'd lived on the mountain. Walking through those doors felt like crossing into enemy territory without a weapon. Every head turned when they entered. Every conversation died. Silas kept his hand on Willa's shoulder, not guiding, not pushing, just there, and walked them to an empty pew near the back. The wood creaked under his weight, and the sound seemed to echo off every wall. Opal Burke twisted around from the third row to get a good look. Her eyes swept over Willa with the efficiency of a livestock judge at a county fair, measuring, assessing, cataloging every detail for later report. "She looks well enough," Opal whispered to her husband loud enough for 6 pews to hear, "but looks don't tell the whole story." "Opal," her husband said wearily, "not now." Reverend Whitfield opened the service with a reading about caring for orphans and widows, which was about as subtle as a sledgehammer. But Silas appreciated the effort. The old preacher had climbed the mountain twice since the auction to check on them. Both times he'd left satisfied that Willa was thriving, and both times he'd told Silas the same thing. "The town needs to see what I've seen. You can't fight rumors with isolation." He was right. Silas knew he was right. That didn't make sitting in a church pew any less excruciating. After the service, the community dinner unfolded in the church hall. Long tables covered in checkered cloth, dishes brought by every family in town, children running between the legs of adults who pretended to scold them while sneaking them extra biscuits. It was the kind of gathering that Silas had avoided for 2 decades. And being inside, it felt like standing in a river with the current pulling at his legs. Willa stayed close to him for the first 10 minutes. Then a girl about her age, Dr. Hale's youngest daughter, approached with the direct fearlessness of a child who hadn't yet learned to be suspicious of strangers. "I'm Clara. Want to see the kittens in the barn?" Willa looked up at Silas. He nodded. She looked back at Clara, considered the offer with the gravity of a diplomat weighing a treaty, and followed her out the side door. Silas watched her go. His chest did something complicated. "She'll be fine," a voice said beside him. Reverend Whitfield had appeared with 2 cups of coffee and the calm expression of a man who'd shepherded anxious souls for 40 years. "Clara Hale could befriend a rock. Your girl's in good hands." "She ain't my girl, isn't she?" Silas took the coffee and said nothing. "You've done well with her, Silas. Better than most would have managed." "I haven't done anything except not hurt her. That shouldn't be remarkable. In this world, for a child like Willa, it is remarkable, and you've done considerably more than not hurt her." Whitfield sipped his coffee. "But I didn't come over here to praise you. I came to warn you. Clarence Yates is in town. Silas's hand tightened on the cup. Now? Today? Arrived last night. He's at the boarding house. Opal Burke has been feeding him supper and stories in equal measure. Of course she has. He's planning to visit your cabin this week, unannounced, so he can observe what he calls the natural domestic situation. Whitfield paused. There's something else. He's been looking into your background, public records, military archives. He knows you weren't born Silas Thornton. The coffee went cold in his hand. For 20 years, he'd built his life on a name that wasn't his, in a place where nobody asked questions because nobody wanted answers. Now a man with a government title and a stack of papers was pulling at threads that could unravel everything. How much does he know? Enough to keep digging. Silas set down the cup. Through the side door of the church hall, he could see Willa crouched in the barn doorway with Clara Hale. Both girls absorbed in something small and furry. She was almost smiling, almost relaxed, almost like a normal child having a normal afternoon. I need to tell you something, Silas said quietly. Something I should have told you months ago. You don't owe me your past. I do if it's going to be used against Willa. Whitfield waited. He was good at waiting. It was maybe his best quality. My name was Solomon Ware. I was a deputy U.S. Marshal for 12 years, served warrants from Texas to Montana Territory. I was good at it. He paused. I was also married. My wife Eliza and my daughter Rosemary lived in a settlement called Wickham Crossing south of the Bitterroot Range. I was away on duty, transporting a prisoner to Fort Ellis, when a gang of outlaws burned the settlement. In retaliation for the arrest of their leader, his voice had gone flat, the way it always went when he talked about this. On the rare occasions he talked about it at all, flat and level and stripped of everything except facts, because the facts were heavy enough without adding feeling to them. Eliza died defending our home. Rosie was 7. They never found her body, but the fire. He stopped. I spent a year searching, following every rumor, every reported sighting. Nothing. Eventually, the service told me to come back or turn in my badge. I turned in my badge, changed my name, headed for the mountains. Whitfield said nothing for a long moment. Then, and now, a man with government authority is going to use that history to question whether you're fit to care for Willa. A man who's been living under a false name for 20 years. A man with a violent profession and a dead family. That's what Yates will see. That's all he'll see. Then we make sure he sees more. Silas shook his head. You don't understand. If Yates decides I'm unfit, he has the authority to remove Willa immediately. No hearing, no appeal. He puts her in a wagon and drives her to the nearest institution, and I never see her again. Then we don't let that happen. How? By doing what you should have done months ago. Stop hiding. Let this town see who you really are, and let them decide if a man who gave everything in service to others deserves the chance to raise one child in peace. Before Silas could answer, the side door opened and Willa came through it with Clara Hale beside her and a gray kitten balanced in her cupped hands. Her eyes found Silas immediately. They always did, scanning for him the way a compass needle finds north. And when she saw his face, the almost smile vanished. She crossed the room fast, handed the kitten to Clara without looking, and stood beside Silas with her hand on his sleeve. She didn't ask what was wrong. She could read him like weather. We should head home, Silas said, before the light goes. Willa nodded. But she kept her hand on his sleeve all the way to the door. Through the goodbyes she acknowledged with small nods, past Opal Burke's watchful eyes, past the cluster of men smoking pipes on the church steps who fell silent as he passed. They were halfway up the mountain trail before she pulled out her journal and wrote by the failing light, "Something bad is coming. Maybe. But I won't let it touch you." She wrote again, "You looked scared. You never look scared." He didn't answer right away. The trail was narrow here, cutting through dense pine where the last sunlight barely reached. Copper picked her way carefully over frozen ground. "There are different kinds of scared," he said finally. "The kind where you're afraid for yourself, and the kind where you're afraid for someone else. The second kind is worse. Willa put the journal away. She leaned back against his chest, and he felt her small hand close around two of his fingers. Holding on, they reached the cabin at dark. Silas built up the fire, made supper, maintained the evening routine that had become their anchor. But the normalcy felt fragile now, like ice over moving water, solid until you put weight in the wrong place. Willa didn't go up to the loft after supper. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table with her journal and wrote for a long time. When she finished, she tore out the page and placed it in front of Silas. "If the man comes and asks me questions, I will tell him the truth. The truth is that you saved me. The truth is that I am happy and safe and learning things I never got to learn before. The truth is that this is my home, and you are my family. If the truth isn't enough for him, then the problem is with him and not with us." Silas read it twice. The handwriting was careful, every letter deliberate, every word chosen by a 6-year-old girl who'd learned that words were the strongest thing a person could own because he'd told her so. "That's exactly right," he said. "Every word." Clarence Yates came on a Thursday. No warning, no courtesy. Just the sound of horses on the frozen trail at mid-morning and a sharp knock on the cabin door that made Willa go rigid in her chair and Silas's hand move by instinct toward the rifle above the mantel before he caught himself and let it drop. He opened the door. 2 men stood on the threshold. The first was thin and precise in a territorial uniform that looked like it had been pressed that morning. The second was a deputy, armed, positioned slightly behind and to the right in the stance of a man providing official backup. "Mr. Thornton." The thin man's voice was clipped and Eastern, or should I say, "Mr. Ware." The name hit like a slap. 20 years of hiding erased in 2 words on a frozen doorstep. "Name's Thornton. Your birth certificate says otherwise, as does your military service record, your marshal's commission, and the death certificates filed for Eliza and Rosemary Ware of Wickham Crossing." The man produced a leather folio and opened it with the practiced efficiency of someone who enjoyed the power of information. "I'm Clarence Yates, Territorial Child Welfare Office. I'm here to inspect the living situation of one Charlotte Willa Foster, age 6, currently in your unauthorized care." "It's not unauthorized. I have a bill of sale from the auction. A bill of sale for a child's labor services. Not a guardianship, not an adoption. A transaction that, frankly, this office considers little better than trafficking." Silas felt the ground shifting under him. Every word out of Yates's mouth was calculated to establish authority and strip Silas of his. "May I come in? Or would you prefer I note in my report that you refused entry to a territorial officer?" Silas stepped aside. Yates entered the cabin, and his gaze moved across the room with the systematic attention of a man cataloging evidence. The clean floors, the well-stocked shelves, the books, the writing paper on the table covered in a child's careful handwriting. Then his eyes found Willa. She sat at the kitchen table with her back straight and her hands folded and her brown eyes fixed on Yates with an expression that contained no fear at all. She'd been afraid of this moment for weeks. She'd written about it in her journal, worked through the anxiety on paper the way Silas worked through his demons with a carving knife. And somewhere in that process, she'd found something on the other side of fear. Not courage, exactly, something quieter, the absolute certainty that she knew what was true, and no man in a pressed uniform could change it. "You must be Charlotte," Yates said, pulling a chair to face her. He sat without being invited. "My name is Willa." The voice that came out of her was clear and steady, and it stopped every person in the room, including Silas, who hadn't heard her speak to a stranger since the day he'd bought her off that platform. She'd been talking more at home over the past weeks. Short sentences, questions, the occasional observation that caught him off guard with its precision, but never to anyone else, never in front of anyone else. Until now. Yates recovered quickly. "Willa, then, I'm Mr. Yates. I'm employed by the government of the territory. My responsibility involves ensuring that children receive appropriate care. Do you comprehend this?" "Yes, sir." "Excellent. I would appreciate the opportunity to pose several questions to you. Would that be acceptable?" Yes, sir. Are you content living here? Yes, sir. Could you elaborate beyond that response? Will examined Yates with the same scrutinizing attention she directed toward everything, the watchful focus of a person who overlooked nothing and squandered nothing. What specific information are you seeking? Could you describe what a regular day looks like for you? I rise before dawn. Silas and I tend to the livestock. We share breakfast together. He instructs me in reading, writing, and mathematics. I work on practicing my penmanship. We collaborate on various projects. He's currently teaching me the craft of wood carving. I'm designing a garden to plant come springtime. Our evenings are spent reading together. That routine appears quite regimented. Does he ever exhibit anger toward you? No, not once. He becomes exasperated with Gertrude. She's our ill-tempered hen. However, he never directs anger at me. He doesn't raise his voice, strike me, or speak words meant to wound. He addresses me as though I were a human being worthy of respect. Don't all grown-ups speak to you with that same respect? The expression Willa directed at him possessed the sharpness of broken glass. No, sir, that is not how they speak to me. Yates repositioned himself in his seat. He redirected his attention to Silas, wearing the expression of someone attempting to reclaim authority over a conversation that had veered off course. Mr. Starr. Where, Thornton? You have existed under a fabricated identity for 2 decades. Surely you comprehend how such circumstances appear to my department. I comprehend the appearance it creates. I also comprehend my motivations for doing so, and those motivations had absolutely nothing to do with evading legal consequences. Then provide an explanation. My wife and daughter lost their lives while I was fulfilling my duties elsewhere. I devoted an entire year to searching for my girl's remains. When that search proved fruitless, I abandoned everything behind, including my given name. That represents a deeply sorrowful story. However, personal tragedy does not automatically qualify someone to raise a child. No, it does not. But actively caring for one does qualify you, doesn't it? Because what my perspective reveals is a man without legal documentation, without connections to the community, without demonstrable resources for providing proper education or social development, residing in complete seclusion with a child he acquired through auction. What your perspective reveals is precisely what you arrived here seeking to discover. I beg your pardon? You reached your conclusion before ascending this mountain. Jake Guthrie and Opal Burke saturated your mind with every piece of information they believed you desired to hear. And you traveled up here carrying your documents and your deputy searching for justification to remove this child, so proceed with your interrogation. Compose your official report, but observe her first. Truly observe her. Yates redirected his gaze toward Willa. She maintained her posture exactly as she had since the beginning, spine erect, eyes clear, composure intact. Her journal rested upon the table before her. Miss Jenny occupied the shelf positioned above the fireplace, beside a wooden horse carved with remarkable skill and a small wooden bird with wings extended in flight. Her coat hung near the entrance, hand-stitched, fitted with precision. Her collection of books sat, arranged neatly on the shelf Silas had constructed at her height. The entire cabin displayed evidence of a child who existed not merely as someone housed, but as someone truly known, not simply fed, but genuinely cherished, not merely surviving, but actively becoming. I resided at the orphanage for 3 full years. Willa spoke into the quiet. Nobody in that place knew what to call me. They referred to me as girl, or you there, or frequently said nothing at all. I remained silent for 2 of those years because no individual there warranted conversation. Her voice maintained its steadiness. Her eyes never wavered from Yates's face. Silas knows what to call me. He knows reading brings me joy. He knows I dream of cultivating a garden. He knows thunderstorms frighten me, but darkness does not. He knows I possess an appetite for learning about absolutely everything, and not once has he suggested I ask too many questions. Child, I comprehend that you experience attachment to— I have not finished speaking. The words emerged sharp and precise, and the room descended into absolute stillness. A girl of 6 years had just instructed a territorial officer to wait for his turn, and the genuine authority resonating in her voice proved so authentic that Yates closed his mouth. Before arriving here, I could not recall the last occasion when somebody repaired something for me simply because it was damaged. Silas mended my doll during my second night here. He remained awake in the cold and stitched her back together with trembling hands because memories of his own daughter, the one he lost, were flooding back. He never disclosed that portion to me. I simply understood. She retrieved her journal and held it pressed against her chest. You may record in your report that I am clean, fed, and warm. That statement is accurate. But if your report claims this man represents anything less than the finest thing that has ever occurred in my life, then you are someone who speaks falsehoods, and I have encountered enough dishonest people to recognize one immediately. The silence that descended afterward extended for a considerable duration. Yates sat completely motionless. The deputy positioned by the entrance studied his boots intently. Silas stood with his spine against the wall, hands resting at his sides, tears streaming down his face without any attempt at concealment, because certain truths proved too immense and too genuine to hide behind the pretense of dignity. When Yates finally found his voice, the quality had transformed, grown quieter. The professional edge remained present, but beneath it lived something that might have been respect, or perhaps shame, or possibly both. I will need to submit a comprehensive report to the territorial governor. Submit whatever documentation you require, Silas responded. I will recommend initiating a formal guardianship procedure, legal documentation, and regular inspections. That arrangement is acceptable. Yates rose and collected his papers. At the entrance, he paused and glanced back at Willa, who had opened her journal and commenced writing as though a territorial inspection represented just another occurrence worth documenting in a life that had finally become worthy of documentation. For whatever value it holds, Yates said, I have conducted inspections of 47 domestic situations throughout this territory. Not one of them has ever delivered the reprimand I received today. He paused. And I have never possessed more thorough conviction that a child was positioned exactly where she belonged. He departed. The deputy followed behind. The sound of horses diminished down the mountain trail until nothing remained except wind, silence, and the scratching of Willa's pencil across paper. Silas remained motionless. He stood against the wall with his arms folded across his chest, holding himself together until Willa set down her pencil and looked toward him. You're shedding tears, she observed. I know I am. Is it the sorrowful kind or the joyful kind? He crossed the room and lowered himself in front of her chair so their eyes met at the same level. Her face appeared calm, but her hands were trembling now. The adrenaline from what she had just accomplished was finally catching up with the courage that had carried her through it. The joyful kind, he said. The very joyful kind. She placed her arms around his neck and held tight, and he wrapped his arms around her small frame and held tight in return. And neither of them spoke another word because nothing remained to be said that their bodies were not already communicating. Outside, the February sun broke through the cloud cover and cast long bars of golden light across the snow. Inside, a mended doll observed from the mantel shelf, while a broken man and a courageous girl held each other in a cabin that had finally transformed into what it was always meant to be. Not a fortress, not a place of hiding, a home. March arrived, and the snow began retreating from the lower meadows like an outgoing tide. Willa's garden beds emerged from beneath the white covering, dark and moist and prepared, and she devoted every morning before breakfast crouched beside them, pressing her fingers into the soil to determine whether it had warmed sufficiently for planting. Silas observed her from the cabin entrance with his coffee and contemplated that if the territorial government could witness what he witnessed, a child kneeling in earth with her entire heart in her hands, they would never question where she belonged. The guardianship documents arrived through mail during the second week of March. Reverend Whitfield brought them up the mountain personally, along with a bottle of whiskey and the information that Clarence Yates had submitted a favorable report to the territorial governor. Silas signed every page. His hand remained steady until the final one, where the printed text stated, "Legal guardian," in letters that made the bond between him and Willa real, in the perception of a world that had never comprehended them anyway. "Congratulations," Whitfield said. "It feels peculiar signing documents for something that already exists. Most of the law simply represents the world catching up to what people already understand in their hearts." Silas poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and they drank in the comfortable silence of men who had expressed everything requiring expression. Through the window, Willa was demonstrating to Clara Hale, who had started accompanying her father on his monthly visits, where the tomatoes would be positioned and why marigolds needed planting around the perimeter. Clara listened with the polite confusion of a town girl who had never deliberately placed her hands in soil. "She has made a friend," Whitfield observed. "She has made several. Mrs. Burke stopped me in the street during my last supply run, offered an apology, said she had been wrong about us." Opal Burke apologized? I may require something stronger than whiskey. 3 weeks later, the peace shattered. Silas was splitting wood behind the cabin when Willa came running from inside with her journal clutched against her chest and an expression he had not witnessed since the day he lifted her off the auction block. Raw fear, the kind that resides in the bones. "Rider approaching," she said. "Not someone familiar to us." He set down the axe and walked around front. A woman was making her way up the trail on a rented horse, riding side saddle with the rigid posture of someone who had learned horsemanship from a book rather than a saddle. She wore a traveling dress too refined for mountain trails, and her dark hair was secured beneath a hat that probably cost more than everything in Silas's cabin combined. She pulled up in the clearing and dismounted with the careful movements of a person whose legs had gone numb. When she turned to face him, Silas felt the ground drop from beneath his feet. She resembled Willa, not identically. 25 years older, polished where Willa was rough, composed where Willa was fierce. But the jawline was identical, the set of the mouth, the way she held herself like someone who expected the world to come at her and was prepared when it did. "Mr. Thornton." Her voice carried the clipped precision of Eastern education. "My name is Harriet Crawford. I believe you have my niece." Willa appeared in the cabin doorway. She looked at the woman. The woman looked at her, and the silence between them held the weight of 3 years of death and distance, and a family tree split down the middle by fever and misfortune. "You resemble Mama," Willa said. Harriet Crawford's composure fractured for exactly 1 second. Her eyes filled, her chin trembled, and her gloved hand pressed against her mouth. Then she pulled herself together with the visible effort of someone who had practiced keeping her feelings behind a wall. "You resemble her too, sweetheart, more than you know." "Don't call me sweetheart. You don't know me." The words landed like stones in still water. Harriet flinched. Silas said nothing. This was Willa's fight and Willa's family and Willa's right to feel whatever she felt about a woman who shared her mother's face but had not shared her mother's suffering. "You are correct," Harriet said quietly. "I don't know you. That is why I am here. To change that, Silas invited her inside because mountain hospitality demanded it and because sending her away would resolve nothing. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she did not drink and explained herself in the measured tones of someone who had rehearsed the speech on the long journey from Street Louis. "Ada was my younger sister. We were close when we were girls, but life took us in different directions. She married your father and moved west. I married Henry Crawford and remained in Street Louis." She paused. "Henry died 2 years ago. Lung disease. I was settling his affairs in Europe when Ada and Thomas passed. By the time I returned and learned what had happened, you had already disappeared into the territorial orphanage system." "I did not disappear," Willa said from her chair across the table. "I was placed there. Nobody came searching. I came searching as soon as I discovered the truth, but the orphanage had closed and the records were scattered, and it took me months to trace you to Cedar Creek." Harriet's voice caught. "I am sorry it took so long. What do you want?" "I want to give you a home. I have a home. A proper home in Street Louis, with schools and music lessons and other children, and someone who is your family, your real family. Silas observed Willa's face go through something complicated. The word real struck her like Guthrie's bid had struck her at the auction. A blow she had been bracing for without realizing it. Because underneath all the strength she had built over the winter, underneath the writing and the carving and the garden plans and the journal entries about feeling safe, there remained a 6-year-old girl who remembered what it felt like to have a mother. And this woman had her mother's face. "Silas is my real family," Willa said. But her voice shook on the word real, and everybody in the room heard it. Harriet turned to Silas. "I do not question what you have done for her. I can see she has been well cared for. But surely you understand that a child needs more than a cabin on a mountain. She needs society, education, the influence of a woman who can guide her. She needs to be where she is loved. I love her. She is my sister's daughter. You love the idea of her. You love your sister's memory. That is not the same thing as loving a child who has nightmares and will not eat if she thinks she has not earned it, and spent 2 years not speaking because the world taught her that her voice did not matter." The accusation hung between them. Harriet's face went white, then red. "You think I cannot learn those things? You think a stranger who bought her at auction knows her better than her own blood? I think I was there, and you were not. Because I did not know." Harriet's composure finally broke. Her voice rose, and her hands gripped the edge of the table, and the polished surface cracked open to show the raw grief underneath. "I did not know Ada was sick. I did not know Thomas had died. I did not know my niece was being sold like property in some God-forsaken frontier town. If I had known, I would have come. I would have been there. But I did not know. And now you are sitting in judgment of me for a failure I could not have prevented." Silence. Willa looked at Harriet with an expression Silas recognized, the same expression she had worn when she handed him Miss Jenny that first night, the face of someone weighing an enormous risk against an enormous need. "My mother used to talk about you," Willa said quietly. "She said you were brave and stubborn and too smart for your own good. She said you would argue with a fence post if you thought the fence post was wrong." Harriet laughed. It came out broken and wet, and sounded so much like Willa's first laugh in the chicken coop that Silas felt his chest ache. "That sounds like Ada," Harriet said. "She always did know me too well. She also said you were kind, that you sent her letters every month and pressed flowers between the pages. Violets. She loved violets. I know. She planted them by our front door. Something passed between them that Silas could not touch and did not try to. It belonged to them, the shared ghost of a woman they had both loved and both lost, connecting them across years and miles and everything that had gone wrong. "I am not leaving," Willa said. "This is my home. Silas is my family, but that does not mean you cannot be my family too." Harriet opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Sweetheart, Willa, I filed a formal custody petition with the territorial court. I did not come here to visit. I came to take you home with me." The warmth that had been building in the room turned to ice. "Then you wasted a trip," Silas said. "The court date is in 3 weeks. Helena Courthouse. Judge Harrison Wells." Harriet's voice had gone professional again, the grief packed away behind legal language. "I have financial resources, social standing, and a blood claim. I do not want to fight you, Mr. Thornton, but I will if I have to. Then you will have to—" Harriet left that afternoon. Silas and Willa stood in the doorway and watched her horse pick its way down the trail until the trees swallowed her up. "She is not a bad person," Willa said. "No, she is not. But she wants to take me away from you. She wants what she thinks is best. Sometimes people do damage trying to do good. What are we going to do? Fight." The 3 weeks before the hearing passed, in a blur of preparation and dread, Samuel Crawford. No relation to Harriet, though the shared name felt like the universe making a cruel joke, was a Helena attorney Reverend Whitfield recommended. Practical, experienced, and unimpressed by social standing. "Blood claims carry weight," Crawford told Silas during their first meeting. But they do not carry everything. The court's job is to determine the child's best interest, not the family's. We prove Willa is thriving with you. We have got a case. Silas gathered everything he could. Dr. Hale's medical assessments, Willa's journal entries, written testimony from Reverend Whitfield, from Mrs. Burke, who threw herself into the effort with the ferocious energy of a woman atoning for past sins, from the schoolmaster who had been testing Willa's reading level and declared it 2 years beyond her age. Willa prepared in her own way. She wrote page after page in her journal, working through her feelings with the methodical honesty that had become her signature. She wrote about her parents, about the orphanage, about the auction, about Silas and the cabin and the garden and Miss Jenny and Gertrude, and every small moment that had built the life she was now being asked to defend. The night before they left for Helena, she brought Silas something she had been working on in secret, a wooden carving, a bird with its wings spread, small enough to fit in his palm, carved from the pine he had given her months ago. The detail was remarkable for someone her age. Every feather suggested, every line of the wings carrying the sense of upward movement, of flight, of something too alive to be held down. I wanted to finish it before the hearing, she said, in case. In case what? She did not answer. She did not have to. In case they lost. In case she was taken. In case this was the last night they would spend in the cabin that had saved them both. Silas held the bird in his scarred hand and felt something in his chest that was too big for the room. This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me. It is because you taught me how. They rode to Helena in the pre-dawn dark, arriving as the courthouse opened its doors. The building was all brick and authority, designed to make ordinary people feel small. Silas felt small, but Willa walked up those stone steps with her back straight and her chin level and her journal under her arm, like a soldier carrying orders into battle. Harriet was already inside. She had brought her own attorney, a Denver man in an expensive suit who arranged papers on the counsel table with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning. Judge Wells called the hearing to order. Harriet's attorney went first. Financial statements, character references from Street Lewis Society, a detailed plan for Willa's education at private institutions. The picture he painted was compelling, a life of privilege and opportunity that Silas could not match with a mountain cabin and a shelf of second-hand books. When Crawford put Silas on the stand, the questions went straight to the heart. What would losing Willa mean to you? It would mean losing the person who taught me I was not beyond saving. And what can you offer her that misses? Crawford cannot? I can offer her the thing she needed most when I found her, and the thing she still needs now. Someone who sees her exactly as she is and does not want to change a single thing about her. Harriet's attorney cross-examined with surgical precision. The isolation, the assumed identity, the lack of feminine influence, every vulnerability exposed, every weakness illuminated under courthouse light. You have been hiding from the world for 20 years, Mr. Thornton. How can a man in hiding teach a child to live? I stopped hiding the day she came into my life. She taught me that. When Willa took the stand, the courtroom shifted. She carried her journal and Miss Jenny, the mended doll that had started everything, and she placed both on the rail in front of her like evidence. Do you understand why we are here? Judge Wells asked. Yes, sir. You are deciding where I live. That is correct. And your feelings matter to this court. Then I would like to say something to my aunt. Wells nodded. Willa turned to face Harriet directly. You came all this way because you loved my mother. I understand that. I loved her too. I miss her every single day. When I look at you, I can see her. And that hurts, and it helps at the same time. She paused. But my mother is gone, and the life you are offering me is the life you wanted for her, not for me. You do not know what I need because you have not been here to find out. Harriet pressed her hand against her mouth. Silas has been here. Every nightmare. Every silent morning when I could not make words come out. Every time I was so scared of being sent away that I cleaned the floor twice because I thought if I was useful enough, maybe I would get to stay. Willa's voice cracked but held. He never once made me feel like I had to earn my place. He just gave it to me, and I gave him something too. I gave him a reason to stop being afraid of loving somebody." She picked up Miss Jenny and held her so the court could see the careful stitches along the mended arm. He fixed her. My second night in the cabin. His hand shook the whole time because she reminded him of his daughter. But he did it anyway, because I needed him to, and because that is who he is. He fixes things, even when it hurts, even when he is scared. She set the doll down and looked at Harriet. "If you really love me, then you will let me stay where I am already loved. And maybe you will stay too. Not to take me away, but to be part of what we have built. Because a family does not have to choose between one person and another. A family can grow." Judge Wells called a recess. Silas sat at the council table with his hands flat on the wood, holding himself still because if he moved, he was going to fall apart in a territorial courthouse, and he would rather die. When court reconvened, it was not the judge who spoke first. It was Harriet. "Your Honor, may I address the court?" Wells nodded. Harriet stood. She looked at Willa, then at Silas, then at her hands folded in front of her. "I came here to take my niece home. I was certain that I knew what was best for her, because I knew what my sister would have wanted." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "But my sister would have wanted Willa to be happy, and Willa is happy. I can see that. Anyone with eyes can see that." She took a breath. "I am not withdrawing my petition, but I am changing it. Instead of seeking sole custody, I am asking the court to grant Mr. Thornton permanent guardianship with formal visitation rights for me. Summers and Street, Louis, if Willa agrees. Holidays, letters, a place in her life. Not instead of what she has, but alongside it." She looked at Silas. "If that is acceptable to you." Silas looked at Willa. Willa looked at him. And in the space between their eyes, the entire negotiation happened in silence, the way it always did between them, in the language they had built from scratch over 6 months of shared meals and mended dolls and winter evenings by the fire. Willa nodded. "It is acceptable," Silas said. Judge Wells granted the modified arrangement with an efficiency that suggested he had been hoping for exactly this outcome: permanent guardianship to Silas Thornton, formal visitation rights to Harriet Crawford, review in 1 year to ensure the arrangement served Willa's interests. Outside the courthouse, the spring sun hit them full in the face. Willa stood between Silas and Harriet on the wide stone steps, holding Silas's hand on one side and, after a moment's hesitation, reaching for Harriet's on the other. Harriet looked down at the small hand in hers, looked at Silas across the top of Willa's head, and for the first time since she had ridden up that mountain trail, she smiled without any armor behind it. "Ada would have liked you," she said to Silas. "She always had a weakness for stubborn men. I am not stubborn. I am right. There is a difference." "There really is not." Willa squeezed both their hands. "Can we go home now? The tomatoes will not plant themselves." They rode back to Cedar Creek together. 3 people on 2 horses, the mountain rising above them like a promise. Harriet sat behind Silas on Copper, gripping the saddle with white knuckles and muttering about the inadequacy of western trails, while Willa rode the pack mule with the easy confidence of a child who had spent a winter learning that the mountain was not something to fear. At the trailhead, Harriet looked up at the long climb ahead, and then at the town behind them where Opal Burke was already positioned on her porch with her notebook. "How often do you make this trip?" "Once a month for supplies." "That seems insufficient. A growing child needs fresh milk and vegetables and social interaction. She has got a garden coming and a chicken that bullies me and friends in town. She is fine. She is more than fine." Harriet adjusted her grip on the saddle, but she could also benefit from a piano. "A piano?" Ada played beautifully. "I would like to teach Willa if she is interested." Silas turned to look at Willa, who was pretending not to listen from the mule. "I would not hate a piano," Willa said. Silas faced forward and urged Copper up the trail. Behind him, Harriet Crawford held on for dear life. And ahead of him, Willa Foster rode toward the only home she had ever chosen, with a mended doll in the saddlebag and a wooden bird in her pocket, and a family that had been broken and remade and was stronger now than it had ever been before. The piano arrived on the back of a freight wagon in late April, wrapped in quilts and roped to the boards like a prisoner being transported across hostile territory. It took 4 men, Silas, Reverend Whitfield, Dr. Hale, and the freight driver, to wrestle it off the wagon and through the cabin door. Harriet supervised from the porch with the intensity of a general directing a siege. Careful with the left leg. That instrument cost more than this entire mountain. It weighs more than this entire mountain, Silas grunted, his back pressed against the door frame while he tried to angle the thing through an opening that had not been built for grand pianos from Street Louis. Willa sat on the porch railing with her journal in her lap, watching the production with visible delight. She had been writing about the piano for weeks, ever since Harriet's first letter from Street. Louis had confirmed that the instrument was on its way. The journal entry from that day read simply, "A piano is coming to the mountain." Mama would have cried. They got it inside. Barely. It sat against the cabin's south wall like a creature from another world, dark and polished and absurdly elegant against the rough-hewn logs and bearskin rug. Gertrude wandered in through the open door, examined the piano legs with suspicious attention, and pecked at the brass pedal before Silas shooed her out. Harriet sat on the bench, flexed her fingers, and played 3 notes. The sound filled the cabin the way sunlight fills a room when you open the curtains. Sudden, warm, impossible to ignore. Willa went still. Her pen stopped moving. Her lips parted. "Your mother loved Chopin," Harriet said. "She used to play this nocturne on winter evenings while your father read in his chair." She began to play. The melody was simple and aching, and it moved through the cabin like a living thing, touching the walls and the books and the wooden carvings on the shelf, and the mended doll that watched from her place by the fireplace. Willa did not move. She stood in the doorway with her journal pressed against her chest and tears running down her face without any attempt to stop them. Silas stepped outside. He sat on the chopping block behind the cabin where nobody could see him and pressed his palms against his eyes and let the music reach him through the log walls. It was the most beautiful and most terrible thing he had heard in 20 years, because beauty and loss were married to each other in ways that could not be separated. And the sound of a piano in his mountain cabin was both a gift and a wound. When the music stopped, he heard Willa's voice. "Teach me. Right now. Right now." By the time Silas came back inside, Willa was sitting beside Harriet on the bench, her small fingers finding the keys with the same careful precision she brought to everything she cared about. Harriet guided her hands with a patience that surprised him. The polished street, Louis woman and the fierce mountain girl, heads bent together over ivory keys, connected by music and blood, and the ghost of a woman they had both loved and both lost. "She has got hands," Harriet said to Silas without looking up. "Long fingers, quick." "She has got her own hands," Silas said. "They just happen to be good at everything." Willa played her first complete scale and looked up at both of them with an expression that contained so much joy it was almost painful to witness. "It sounds like the creek when the ice melts, like everything waking up at once." Harriet stayed for 2 weeks that first visit. She slept in the loft. Willa insisted on sharing, and Silas built a second bed frame in a single afternoon with the focused energy of a man who needed to keep his hands busy while his home rearranged itself around him. The days fell into a rhythm that should not have worked but did. Mornings belonged to Silas and Willa. Animals, breakfast, lessons, garden work. Afternoons belonged to Harriet. Piano, reading aloud from books she had brought from Street Louis. Stories about Ada that made Willa laugh and cry, sometimes in the same sentence. Evenings belonged to all 3 of them, sitting by the fire while Willa read from her journal, and Harriet learned to drink coffee strong enough to strip paint, and Silas discovered that having another adult in his home did not feel like an invasion after all. It felt like a wall he had not known was there coming down. "You are different than I expected," Harriet told him one evening after Willa had climbed up to the loft. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the lamp between them, coffee going cold. "What did you expect?" "Honestly, a brute. The kind of man who takes a child because he needs someone to cook and clean. She wrapped her hands around her cup. Instead, I found a man who built a smaller chair so a 6-year-old could reach the table. She needed a chair. She needed a great deal more than a chair, and you gave her all of it. Harriet paused. I owe you an apology. When I filed that custody petition, I was thinking about what I had lost. My sister, my niece, the years I should have been part of Willa's life. I was not thinking about what Willa had found. You were thinking like family. Cannot fault someone for that. You can fault someone for being so focused on their own grief that they nearly destroyed someone else's happiness. Nearly. But you did not. You changed your mind when it mattered. Because Willa changed it for me. Harriet smiled. She has a gift for that, for making people see what is actually in front of them instead of what they have decided should be there. She gets that from her mother. I would guess she gets some of it from you. Harriet left in May, promising to return in July. Willa stood in the clearing and watched her ride down the trail until the trees swallowed her, then turned to Silas with dry eyes and a steady voice. She will come back. She will. I know. Because she left half her books here. Aunt Harriet does not go anywhere without her books. The garden exploded in June. Everything Willa had planned through the long winter months burst from the soil with a vitality that bordered on miraculous. Tomatoes climbed the stakes. Silas had helped her set. Beans spiraled up the trellis she designed herself. Marigolds blazed orange and gold around the borders, and the herb beds released scent every time the wind shifted. But it was the flower garden along the cabin's east wall that stopped people in their tracks. Violets, rows of them, planted from seeds Harriet had brought from street. Louis, growing where Silas's first wife's garden had once been. Willa had planted them without telling anyone, and the morning they bloomed, she had brought Silas outside and stood beside him in the early light while he stared at the purple flowers and could not speak. For your Eliza, Willa said, and for my mama, because they both loved growing things, and this ground deserved to have flowers again. He knelt in the dirt beside her and pulled her into a hug so fierce she squeaked. You did this. The dirt did most of the work. I just told it what to grow. Word of the garden spread through Cedar Creek the way word of everything spread, fast, embellished, and with Opal Burke's editorial commentary attached. But this time the commentary was different. You should see what that child has done with that mountain, Opal told anyone who came within earshot of her boarding house porch. Turned a hermit's hideout into a proper homestead, flowers everywhere, and the man himself, I swear he smiled at me last Tuesday. Smiled. Nearly fell off my chair. People started making the climb, not to inspect or investigate or judge, but to see what everyone was talking about, the mean old mountain man and the little girl who changed him. They came with excuses, returning borrowed tools, bringing surplus preserves, asking about seed varieties. And they left having seen something they could not quite explain but could not stop thinking about. A home that worked, a family that fit. Two people who had been broken by the world and had somehow mended each other into something whole. Clarence Yates made his required 6-month follow-up visit in July. He arrived on the same horse with the same leather folio, but without the deputy. Willa met him at the door. Mr. Yates, would you like to see my garden? He would. She gave him the full tour, naming every plant, explaining her rotation system, pointing out where the fall crop would go. Yates listened with the attentive seriousness of a man who understood he was witnessing something he would report on for years. You have been busy, he said. Busy is better than bored, and bored is better than scared. I am not any of those things anymore, though. I am just happy. His report to the territorial governor was 2 sentences long. Child is thriving in every measurable respect. Recommend no further intervention. Harriet returned in July as promised, bringing 3 trunks of books, a crate of sheet music, and a deep sunburn from the stage journey that made Willa laugh so hard she had to sit down. I look like a lobster, Harriet said grimly, examining her reflection in the cabin window. You look like somebody who does not belong on a horse, Silas observed. I do not belong on a horse. I belong in a drawing room with proper ventilation and iced tea. And yet here I am, voluntarily climbing a mountain for the third time because a 7-year-old girl has better powers of persuasion than any lawyer I have ever met. I am almost 7, Willa corrected. My birthday is in August. They celebrated it together. Silas carved her a new set of animals, a horse, a deer, an eagle with outstretched wings, each one more detailed than the last, each one carrying the skill of a man who had remembered that making beautiful things was not a waste of time, but a declaration that beauty mattered. Harriet gave her a leather-bound journal embossed with her initials and a fountain pen that made Willa's eyes go round as dinner plates. "For your writing," Harriet said, "because your words deserve better than pencil on scrap paper." Willa held the pen like it was made of gold. "This is the best present anyone has ever given me." "I gave you a horse," Silas said. "A wooden horse. A very good wooden horse. The second best present anyone has ever given me." Clara Hale came up for the birthday with her father, bringing a cake her mother had baked and a kitten she had been hiding under her coat. The kitten was gray with white paws, and Willa named it Chopin, which made Harriet nearly choke on her cake with laughter. A cat named after a composer. Ada would have been delighted. Mama would have named it something practical, like Mouse Catcher, Willa said. But I think things should be named for what they make you feel, not what they do. The summer stretched long and golden. Willa divided her days between the garden and the piano and her journal and the carving bench, where she was producing work that made Silas shake his head in genuine amazement. Her hands had found their gift. Not just competence, but artistry. An ability to see inside a block of wood to the shape that wanted to come out and then bring it into the light with patience and care. She carved a flower for Harriet, a horse for Clara, a chicken for Doctor, Hale that bore such an uncanny resemblance to Gertrude that the doctor displayed it on his office shelf and told patients it was a portrait of his most difficult patient. For Silas, she carved something different. She worked on it through August and into September, hiding it in the loft, refusing to let him see it. He heard the knife working at night after she thought he was asleep. The steady scrape and whisper of blade on wood that had become as familiar as wind in the pines. She gave it to him on the first day of fall. They were sitting on the porch together, watching the aspens turn gold on the mountainside. When she reached into her pocket and placed something in his hand, it was a cabin. Small enough to fit in his palm, carved from a single piece of pine with extraordinary detail. The door was open. In the doorway stood 2 figures, a tall man and a small girl, and beside the cabin, no bigger than his thumbnail, was a garden in full bloom. Silas held it and could not speak. "Turn it over," Willa said. On the bottom, carved in letters so small he had to squint to read them, were 2 words, "Our home." He closed his hand around the carving and pressed it against his chest. His eyes burned, his throat locked. 20 years of grief and isolation and self-punishment, and this is what had broken through all of it. Not time, not forgiveness, not faith or community or the slow healing of wounds. A child who had been as broken as he was, and who had chosen him anyway, and in choosing him had given him the one thing he had never been able to give himself, permission to live again. "I love you," Willa said. She said it the way she said everything, direct, unadorned, certain. I know you know that already, but I wanted to say it out loud, because words matter, and some words need to be heard, not just understood. "I love you too," Silas said, and his voice cracked down the middle like a log splitting along the grain. And he did not care. "More than I know how to say. More than I thought I was still capable of. You are capable of a lot more than you think. You just needed somebody to show you." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, fitting against him the way she always did, like a missing piece finding its place. Chopin, the cat, appeared from under the porch and draped himself across both their feet with the boneless entitlement of a creature who owned everything he touched. From inside the cabin came the sound of the piano. Harriet, who had stayed through the summer and was now talking about renting a room in Cedar Creek so she could visit whenever she wanted, was playing the Chopin Nocturne again. The melody drifted through the open door and across the clearing and into the trees, where it mixed with bird song and wind and the distant sound of the creek running over stones. "Silas? Yeah? Do you think Rosemary would have liked me?" He had told Willa about Rosie over the summer. All of it. The whole story from the beginning. Not because he owed her his past, but because she had earned it, and because keeping it hidden had started to feel less like protection and more like dishonesty. She had listened the way she always listened, with her whole body, her whole attention, her whole enormous heart, and when he finished, she had taken his hand and held it for a long time without saying anything. "She would have loved you," Silas said. "She would have followed you around the garden asking why every plant grows the way it does, and whether dirt has feelings." Willa laughed. "Does dirt have feelings? I reckon it does. I reckon everything that grows something beautiful has feelings. It just shows them different than we do." The sun moved behind the peaks, and the golden light went amber, then rose, then deep purple. The aspens shivered in the evening breeze, and the first stars appeared above the ridgeline. From the barn, Copper whickered for her supper. Gertrude made a sound of general complaint from the chicken coop, as she always did when the day did not end on her specific terms. "Time to do the evening rounds," Silas said. "I will get the chickens. Gertrude pecked me again this morning." "Gertrude pecks you every morning. I think it is her way of saying she likes you." "Gertrude does not like anyone. Gertrude likes me." "Gertrude is terrified of you." "That is not the same thing." Willa hopped off the porch and headed for the coop with Chopin trotting behind her. Silas watched her go. She moved through the clearing with the easy confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. And every step she took on that mountain ground felt like proof of something he had stopped believing was possible, that you could lose everything and still find something worth having, that you could be broken past repair and still be mended by someone who did not know you were supposed to be beyond saving. That love was not something the world gave you as a reward for good behavior. It was something that showed up when you least expected it, in forms you had never imagined, and demanded that you be brave enough to let it in. Harriet appeared in the cabin doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Supper in 20 minutes. I am making Ada's recipe for cornbread." "Last time you made cornbread, Chopin would not eat it," Silas said. "The cat has no taste." "The cat ate a moth this morning. I think his taste is just different from yours." "Are you comparing my cooking to a moth?" "I would not dare, ma'am." "Smart man." She went back inside. Silas stood and stretched and looked out at the life he had somehow built from the ruins of the one he had lost. The cabin with its open door and lamplight spilling warm across the porch boards. The garden with its last summer blooms holding on against the coming cold. The piano music starting up again as Harriet played something gentle into the evening air. And Willa coming back from the coop with eggs in her apron and Gertrude's feather in her hair and a grin that could light the whole valley. "3 eggs, she announced, and Gertrude only tried to kill me once. Progress. Everything is progress. She climbed the porch steps and stopped beside him. "Silas?" "Thank you." "For what?" "For bidding $20 on a girl nobody wanted." He looked down at her. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw everything. The auction block, the silent ride up the mountain, the broken doll, the first word she wrote, the first laugh she laughed, the first time she called this place home, all of it. Every moment that had brought them from strangers to family, from broken to whole, from alone to this. "You were always wanted," he said. The world just had not figured it out yet. Willa took his hand, and they walked inside together. Into the warmth, into the light, into the smell of cornbread burning slightly because Harriet had gotten distracted by Chopin again. Into the sound of laughter that filled every corner of a cabin that had been silent for 20 years and would never be silent again. On the mantel shelf, Miss Jenny watched over all of it, mended and faded and loved beyond measure. Her stitched arm held firm. Her button eyes reflected the firelight. And on the shelf beside her sat a wooden bird with its wings spread wide, a carved cabin small enough to fit in a man's palm, and a leather sewing case with initials worn soft by time. Three relics of three lives that had converged in a place where the mountains met the sky and proved once and for all that the strongest things in this world are the ones that have been broken and put back together by hands that refuse to give up. Willa Foster was safe. She was loved. She was home. And so, at last, was he.